What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is January 9th, 2026, about 9:30 p.m. where I'm at right now, and we are continuing our 17th book in our Book to React series. This is episode 17 of A History of Psychology from Antiquity to Modernity, a very dense, a very hard, a very intense book, a textbook we're reading from the mysterious Professor Thomas Hardy Leahey, man. We are trying to get it in. We are fighting that good fight, fighting this text page by page. We are in the middle of chapter 7. Chapter 7 has been kicking my ass, and we are picking up where we left off in the section starting at page 204, Inventing Methods for Psychology. We will be starting here on mental testing, which is on page 206. And hopefully after this, we will have some time. We will have some time later to maybe do a live call-in show. Let me just fix this up right here, and let's go. So we're starting here, mental testing. Another way of measuring the mind, the mental test, arose in the 19th century and was fundamental for the founding of applied psychology. Mental tests were not invented for scientific reasons, but in the service of public education. In the second half of the 19th century, governments began first to provide universal primary education and then to make it compulsory. Compulsory education was motivated by the need of the new industries and businesses for a more educated workforce and by the desire of governments to control their citizens' thoughts. A French minister of education said, "Never shall we accept that the education of the people should be a private industry." Education was to remain a state monopoly, resistant to privatization schemes such as vouchers. As children were inducted into the new schools, it became desirable to establish standards of achievement, to evaluate students with respect to these standards, and to measure differences in children's mental abilities. Experimental psychology studied the normal human mind, regarding individual differences as error variance to be minimized by careful experimental control. Mental testing, on the other hand, was directly concerned with carefully measuring individual differences. For mental testing, there was no normal human mind, only the average one. Some early mental testing was based on phrenology, which had inherited from Gall the goal of determining differences in mental and personal abilities. Popular phrenology foreshadowed future developments in mental testing, ranging from personnel selection to premarital counseling, and especially in America, phrenologists tried to use their methods in the interest of educational reform. However, phrenology did not work and fell into disfavor. More scientific methods of mental testing were developed in Great Britain and in France, and the way testing developed in the two countries was influenced by the legacies of British and French philosophy. Testing in Britain. Sir Francis Galton, born 1822 and died 1911, was a well-to-do cousin of Charles Darwin and collaborated with him on disappointing experiments on the basis of heredity. Galton became interested in the evolution of mental traits, and in his Hereditary Genius, he proposed to show that a man's natural abilities are derived by inheritance, under exactly the same limitations as are the form and physical features of the whole organic world. He traced the lineages of families in which physical abilities seemed to pass from parent to child, and other families in which mental abilities did the same. Thus, for example, he would show that one family produced generations of outstanding college wrestlers, while another produced outstanding lawyers and judges. Above all, Galton wanted to measure intelligence. For him, the master mental ability. He looked at school children's examination scores to see if children who did well or badly in one subject did well or badly in all. To this end, he devised the correlation coefficient, known today as the Pearson product moment correlation. Because Galton's student, Carl Pearson, born 1857 and died in 1936, perfected its calculation. Galton found that there was a strong correlation among examination grades, supporting the idea that intelligence is a single mental ability. Galton's claim began the still unresolved controversy over general intelligence. Followers of Galton believe that most intelligence can be accounted for by a single psychometric factor. critics believe that intelligence is composed of multiple skills, not intelligence, but intelligences. Rather than depending on teachers' imprecise grades, Galton then tried to measure intelligence more directly and precisely. His methods were rooted in British empiricism. If the mind is a collection of ideas, as Hume taught, then a person's intelligence would depend on how precisely he or she could represent the world in consciousness. Measures of sensory acuity, then, would be measures of intelligence. The focus on consciousness was also consistent with the German introspective study of the contents of consciousness, and some of Galton's measures were adaptations of psychophysical methods. In addition, Galton also believed, as did many scientists, including Broca, that the bigger the brain, the more intelligent the mind it caused. Therefore, head size would also be of intelligence. In South Kensington, a suburb of London, Galton established an anthropometric laboratory at which people could take his mental test. A similar exhibit introduced Americans to psychology at the Columbian Exposition in 1893. Galton's anthropometric laboratory created one of three important models for the conduct of psychological work, the other two being the laboratory and the medical clinic. Galton studied ordinary people, not the highly educated, trained observers of the German introspective laboratories or the pathological subjects of the French clinics. They paid a small fee to take the test and were called applicants. Galton's practice probably emulated phrenology, in which people paid fees to have their heads examined. Galton himself had at one time visited a phrenologist. Galton contributed twice to applied psychology by inventing mental tests and by introducing the professional rather than scientific fee-for-service model of practice. Although Galton was the first to try to develop tests of intelligence as a practical matter, his tests were failures. Sensory acuity is not the basis of intelligence, and the correlation between brain size and intelligence is extremely small. Nevertheless, Galton's approach to intelligence and his evolutionary approach to the mind proved quite influential, especially in America. Galton's methods were carried on by James McKean Cattell, born 1860 and died in 1944, who coined the term mental test. Cattell took his degree with Wundt to Leipzig, but worked in the anthropometric laboratory under Galton, epitomizing the historian of psychology E.G. Boring's remark that although American psychologists got their brass instruments from Wundt, they got their inspiration from Galton. Testing in France. In Paris, Alfred Binet, who was born in 1857 and died in 1911, developed a more effective and durable means of measuring intelligence. Binet was a law student turned psychologist. Typical for a French psychologist, he was introduced to the field through the medical clinic, studying with Charcot. His early work concerned hypnosis. He conducted studies in many areas of psychology, and he was a co-founder of the first psychological institute in France at the Sorbonne in 1889. But he is most remembered for his intelligence test. Binet's approach to testing combined the Cartesian emphasis on the highest mental functions of the mind with the French clinical orientation. In Galton's anthropometric laboratory and in the experimental laboratories of Germany, psychologists focused on simple sensory motor functionings. Binet, in contrast, studied high-level cognitive skills such as chess. He wrote, "If one wishes to study the differences existing between two individuals, it is necessary to begin with the most intellectual and complicated processes." Binet's roots in the clinic also shaped his psychological research. Unlike the brief and anonymous studies of the laboratory, Binet studied individuals in great depth, even publishing their photographs in his publications. Binet, along with co-worker Victor Henry, born 1872 and died in 1940, defined the field of individual as opposed to German experimental psychology in an article, La Psychologie Individuelle, in 1895. They announced the practical value of their form of psychology, wishing to illuminate the practical importance the topic has for the pedagogue, the doctor, the anthropologist, even the judge. Binet's article is an important early manifesto of applied psychology. Binet's test was developed through his work on a government commission formed in 1904 to study the education of the mentally subnormal. Binet had already studied cognitive development in children and had been a founder of the Free Society for the Psychological Study of the Child in 1899. The government's aims called for a psychological version of clinical diagnosis in medicine. Mentally subnormal children interfered with the education of normal children, and the commission was charged to come up with a way to diagnose subnormal children, especially those on the borderline of normal functioning. Binet developed a practical test based on assembling a scale of intellectual tasks that could be performed by normal children at specific ages. Then one could compare the performance of a given child to that of his or her age mates. The subnormal child was one who could not solve the problems solved by children of the same age. Subnormal children could then be detected, removed from the classroom, and given special education. Binet's rough and ready practical test was much more useful than Galton's theoretically driven test. American psychologist Henry Goddard, born 1866 and died in 1957, a teacher turned psychologist, was a research psychologist at an institution that housed children with a variety of disorders such as epilepsy, autism, and mental retardation. The Vineland in New Jersey, the Vineland Training School for Feeble-Minded Boys and Girls was the name of this institution. An important problem for Goddard was determining which children were mentally subnormal and which were physically ill. Goddard initially tried to use Galton-like modifications of standard laboratory methods, but they proved useless. He learned about Binet's test on a visit to Europe in 1908 and introduced it to Vineland, where he found it met our needs. The test was more carefully adapted into English by Louis Terman, born 1877 and died in 1956, whose first encounter with psychology was when a phrenologist examined him as a child. Terman standardized his Stanford Binet intelligence scales on large numbers of normal children, introducing greater scientific rigor to intelligence testing. Going on to testing in Germany. Educational psychology and mental testing also developed in Germany, though more slowly than elsewhere. William Stern, born 1871 and died in 1938, introduced the concept of the intelligence quotient, or IQ, a quantitative way of stating a child's mental standing with respect to his or her peers. Binet's test allowed one to measure the mental age of a child that then could be set in a ratio to his or her chronological age. Thus, if a 10-year-old child passed the items typically passed by 10-year-olds, the child's IQ was 1010, equaling 1, which Stern multiplied by 100 to eliminate decimals. Hence, normal IQ was always 100. A subnormal child would have an IQ less than 100, and an advanced child would have an IQ above 100. Although IQ is no longer calculated this way, the term remains in use, although Stern himself came to regard its influence as pernicious. The influence of mental testing was profound. It was the founding cornerstone of applied psychology, providing a concrete method by which psychology could be applied in a variety of areas, beginning in education but soon moving to fields such as personnel placement and personality assessment. Mental testing has become an important social force. People's educational and career paths have been shaped and sometimes even determined by scores on mental tests. People have been ordered to be sterilized because of the results of mental tests. As a practical matter, the everyday impact of mental testing has been much greater than that of experimental psychology. the legacy of mental testing runs so deep. When I think about my own life, I was deadly scared of taking the SAT and the ACT, even though I scored very well on the ACT, at least by the standards back then, right? And I also remember being in middle school and taking like a job aptitude type test where they tell you what they think the best career would be for you, right? And I remember scoring high on like being like a lawyer or like a professor or something like that. But my desire back then was to be an artist, right? And that also was an area I scored high in and stuff like that. What else? And just the idea of intelligence testing or mental testing has left a legacy. People talk about IQ all day. And it's funny that he says here the inventor of IQ, William Stern, said the legacy of IQ has been pernicious. And I agree with that, because if IQ were so important, then why don't we just get rid of the ACT, the SAT, and use IQ tests to determine who should go to Harvard? But I digress. I don't mean to get caught up in that. Continuing here, philosophy to the threshold of psychology. In 1851, Alexander Bain wrote to his friend and colleague John Stuart Mill, "There is nothing I wish more than so to unite psychology and physiology. That physiologist." Let's read that again. In 1851, Alexander Bain wrote to his friend and colleague John Stuart Mill, "There is nothing I wish more than so to unite psychology and physiology, that physiologists may be made to appreciate the true ends and drift of their researches into the nervous system." Bain fulfilled his desire in two massive volumes, The Senses and the Intellect, and The Emotions and the Will. One published in 1855, the other in 1859. Bain's comprehensive survey of psychology from the standpoints of associationism and physiology embraced every psychological topic from simple sensation to aesthetics and ethics. Bain's importance lies in his synthesis of material borrowed from others. The idea of uniting physiology and philosophical psychology was ancient. His associationism derived from Hartley and the Mills. His physiology was drawn from the sensory-motor physiology of the German physiologist Johannes Müller, born 1801 and died in 1858. In his Elements of Physiology, published in 1842, Müller had already proposed that the role of the brain is to associate incoming sensory information with appropriate motor responses. Bain knew the elements and incorporated Müller's conception of the role of the brain into his psychology. Thus, Bain united the philosophy of associationism with sensory-motor physiology to give a unified human psychology. Even today, most general psychology texts are organized like Bain's, beginning with the simple nerve function and sensation and working up to thinking and social relations. Bain's integration was quite influential. He wrote before the functions of the cerebrum were known, and his uncompromising associative view of physiology guided later English investigators to press their studies into the mysterious cerebral hemispheres. Bain had a considerable lasting effect on psychology. The journal Mind, which he founded in 1874, is still in existence as an organ of philosophical psychology. He remained, however, a philosopher, despite his use of physiological data. He did no experiments, and although he recognized the importance of Darwin's work, his associationism remained pre-evolutionary. In the long run, it was his practical attitude towards psychology that mattered. Like the phrenology that had once excited him, Bain wanted to explain human action, not just consciousness. His ideas about behavior would be developed by American pragmatists. The last notable French philosophical psychologist was Hippolyte Adolphe Taine. Hippolyte is a crazy name. Hippolyte Adolphe Taine was born in 1828 and died in 1893. Although most of his works were on history and literature, he was most proud of his psychological book On Intelligence, published in 1875, which William James used as his text when he first taught psychology at Harvard. In On Intelligence, Taine presented an associative psychology similar to Bain's, arguing that all ideas, no matter how apparently abstract, can be reduced to a collection of sensations associated with each idea's name. The business of psychology would thus be similar to chemistry's, to decompose compounds into their elements to show the different groupings these elements are capable of, and to construct different compounds with them. Following Leibniz, Taine proposed that conscious sensations are simply aggregates of weaker, more fleeting sensations that are only marginally conscious at best. Taine also discussed the physiological substrates of sensation. He maintained a dual-aspect psychophysical parallelism, holding that every event in consciousness has a corresponding neural event. According to Taine, the reverse is not true because some neural events give rise only to unconscious sensations. Taine's neurophysiology presents the brain as an unspecialized organ associating stimulus in response. The brain, then, is the repeater of the sensory centers. That is, the brain simply copies incoming neural information as mental images copy sensations. Mind and brain are both seen in terms similar to Hume's or Hartley's. Taine's importance lies less in the details of his psychology than in his treatment of psychology as a naturalistic discipline. He and his colleague, Théodule Ribot, born 1839 and died 1916, rejected the Catholic psychology that had so far dominated French psychological thinking, still seeing psychology as very much the study of the soul. They introduced British ideas as a secular counterweight to French Catholic spiritual psychology. In Germany, philosophical psychology struggled with the mixed legacy of Kantian idealism. Certain concepts of the idealists found a place in early German psychology. Wundt studied individual consciousness, proposed a historical generic approach to the investigation of the higher mental processes, and stressed human will as the unifying force in mental life. All of these ideas he inherited as aspects of idealistic philosophy. Freud, too, was influenced by Schopenhauer's concept of unconscious, primitive forces lurking in the personality. Nevertheless, the German idealists following Kant took a dim view of psychology as a would-be science. Psychology studies only a concrete individual or a set of individuals, whereas the idealists sought transcendent Platonic knowledge of a godlike absolute spirit, which they took to be the noumenal reality behind the physical appearances and the individual mind. Empirical research seems trivial in the idealist context, and the idealist, most forcefully Hegel, actively opposed the development of empirical psychology. The leading German philosophical psychologist was Hermann Lotz, born 1817 and 1881 is when he died. Before he turned to philosophy, Lotz received his medical degree, and he was Fechner's friend and physician. In one respect, Lotz appears to be German psychology's Bain or Taine. In his Outlines of Psychology, published in 1881, Lotz proposed an empiricist view of consciousness, saying, for example, with Berkeley, that depth perception is learned, not innate, and experience is compounded out of simple ideas. He integrated this empiricism with the growing sensory-motor concept of brain function. However, Lotz was not wholly dedicated to empiricism and naturalism. He insisted that although physiology offered a valid approach to the material aspects of mind and behavior, both human beings and animals possess divinely given souls. As was typical of German philosophers, Lotz emphatically rejected materialism in favor of Cartesian dualism. By insisting on the spiritual side of humans, Lotz earned the admiration of English-speaking psychologists who were dissatisfied with the associationistic and reductive psychologies they found around them. Among them were James Ward, the English psychologist who bitterly attacked naturalism, and William James, the tender-minded psychologist who took part in psychical research. Hermann von Helmholtz, born 1821 and died in 1894, probably the greatest physical scientist of the 19th century, was a more consistent exponent of naturalism and empiricism. For much of his career, he was occupied with physiology. We have already learned of his measurement of the speed of nerve conduction. He also conducted definitive studies of physiological optics and acoustics, but he was also a leading physicist. He formulated the law of conservation of energy when he was only 26. The law of conservation of energy struck a death blow to interactive dualism. Because energy can neither be created nor destroyed, no spiritual force can affect matter. Helmholtz's approach to the mind was essentially that of a Lockean empiricism in which ideas are interpreted as mental content. Helmholtz argued that all we know for certain are our ideas or images of the world gathered by experience. He struck a pragmatic note by acknowledging that we cannot know whether our ideas are true, but argued that this does not matter as long as they lead to effective action in the real world. Science was an example of such effective action. Although he followed Kant in holding causality to be an innate principle, Helmholtz, like the empiricists, maintained that the other Kantian categories of knowledge are acquired. Of particular importance to psychology was Helmholtz's theory of unconscious inference. If, for example, visual perception of space is not an innate intuition, as Berkeley argued, then, in the course of development, we must learn to calculate the distance of objects from us. Yet we are not aware of performing such calculations. Helmholtz theorized that these kinds of calculations or inferences must be unconscious and moreover must be unconsciously learned, as happens in language acquisition. Like words, ideas, including sensations, are mental contents that represent reality. Just as children learn language spontaneously and with no direct instruction, so too they spontaneously and unconsciously learn the meanings of ideas. As we would expect of a physicist and physiologist, Helmholtz was a forceful advocate of the natural sciences. He welcomed their growth in the German universities and heaped scorn on idealistic philosophers, for whom natural science was the trivial study of physical reality, which was of no consequence compared to the spirit behind physical reality. Furthermore, Helmholtz's own theory and research supported materialism. His physiological studies of sensation established the dependence of perception on fleshly matter. His theory of the conservation of energy inspired some young physiologists to swear, as Helmholtz's friend Émile Dubois-Reymond put it in a letter, a solemn oath to put in effect this truth: no other forces than the common physical chemical ones are active within the organism. In his early manuscript, Psychology for Neurologists, Sigmund Freud carried this spirit of reductionism into psychology. Helmholtz, however, was aware of the dangers of making materialism into an ideology when he wrote, in Thought in Medicine, our generation has had to suffer under the tyranny of spiritualistic metaphysics. The younger generation will probably have to guard against materialistic metaphysics. He continued, please do not forget that materialism is a metaphysical hypothesis. If one forgets this, materialism becomes a dogma. Compare this to the solemn oath discussed earlier. Materialism becomes a dogma which hinders the progress of science and, like all dogmas, leads to violent intolerance. Helmholtz could not accept spiritualism or vitalism, but neither could he accept aggressive materialism. Psychopathology. The final important root of organized psychology lies in medicine, in the study of disordered minds. Psychology thus impinges on psychiatry, and in France especially, psychology was linked to psychiatry and neurology, the branches of medicine that treat the mentally ill. Psychiatry and neurology. The insane have always been with us, but before the 18th century, they were treated very badly, even brutally. Recent historical claims that mad people happily wandered the medieval countryside and became locked up and mistreated only in modern times have been exposed as myths. There were private and public asylums for the mad, but most remained with their families who, at a loss to cope, confined them and mistreated them. An Irish politician in 1817 said that when a family member goes mad, the only way they have to manage is by making a hole in the floor of the cabin, not high enough for the person to stand up in, with a crib over it to prevent his getting up. And they give this wretched being his food there, and there he generally dies. Psychiatry was created by the Enlightenment Project, reforming asylums from places that simply warehoused the insane, treating them, if at all, with the traditional methods of pre-modern medicine, such as bleeding and the administration of emetics. The goal of the new field of psychiatry was to make the asylum itself a treatment for the mad. The term psychiatry was coined by Johann Christian Ryle, born 1759 and died 1813. Ryle coined this term in 1808. Although just as it took the term psychology decades to catch on, the older term alienist remained widely used. Ryle voiced typical Enlightenment hopes for this new field. He said, "The physicians of England, France, and Germany are all stepping forward at once to improve the lot of the insane. The cosmopolite sees joyously the untiring efforts of mankind to ensure the welfare of one's neighbor. The horrors of the prisons and the jails are over. A bold race of men dares to take on this gigantic idea of wiping from the face of the earth one of the most devastating of pestilences." The transformation in the treatment of the mad that Ryle greeted with such enthusiasm and hope was the introduction of moral therapy into a few European asylums in the late 1790s. In this context, moral therapy meant mental therapy as opposed to traditional medical therapy. Moral therapy aimed at curing rather than merely isolating the insane. Although it was not yet psychotherapy, moral therapy moved in that direction. The idea behind moral therapy was that by freeing patients from their chains and then having them live carefully structured lives with their fellow inmates, they could regain their sanity. As one psychiatrist described it, subject to an orderly life, to discipline, to a well-calibrated regimen, they are obliged to reflect upon the change in their life. The necessity of adjusting, of behaving well with strangers, of living together with their companions in suffering are powerful allies in achieving restoration of their lost reason. In 1801, an influential textbook by Philip Pinel, published in 1745 and Philip Pinel lived from 1745 to 1826. Pinel made moral therapy the gold standard for asylum psychiatry. Unfortunately, the good intentions of the first psychiatrists were overwhelmed by the rise in the number of inmates during the 19th century. And by the early 20th century, asylums had again become places where the insane were warehoused, now on a huge scale, rather than treated. Psychiatry entered the German university a little earlier than psychology. In 1865, through the efforts of Wilhelm Griesinger, who was born in 1817 and died in 1868. Because of the German university's emphasis on research, psychiatry became more scientific. The key figure in the development of modern psychiatry was Emil Kraepelin, born 1856, died 1926. A great problem facing psychiatrists was seeing through bizarre symptoms to underlying illnesses. Kraepelin was a psychiatrist who became fascinated by psychology, undertaking study in Wundt's laboratory. Thus trained as a scientist, he sifted through case histories looking for patterns of symptoms and outcomes. Out of his research came the first scientifically informed psychiatric diagnosis, dementia praecox, or premature dementia, now known as schizophrenia. He went on to develop a nosological system that revolutionized the diagnosis and treatment of the insane. Kraepelin drew attention away from the content of psychotic symptoms. It did not matter if a paranoid's delusions concerned Satan or the state, to whether or not specific symptoms were associated with the cause and outcome of the underlying disease. American psychiatrist Adolf Meyer spoke for the psychiatric community, standing in awe of Kraepelin's achievement. The terms and traditions of over 2,000 years are overthrown. Patients paid a certain price for the advancement of scientific psychology. Although Kraepelin cared deeply for his patients, many professors of psychiatry did not, seeing them only as specimens for scientific investigation. Problems less severe than madness, the neuroses were treated by neurologists. Neurologists supervised rest cures at spas. Neurologists supervised rest cures at spas and consulted with patients in private offices. By the end of the century, however, the two fields had become effectively merged under the rubric of psychiatry. In both fields, there was movement towards psychotherapy, a term coined by two Dutch psychiatrists in 1887. In moral therapy, stress was placed on having a therapeutic, one-to-one relationship between the psychiatrist and patient, in addition to the structured life of the asylum. Initially, neurologists thought to cure their patients by physical means, for example, by hosing excitable patients with cold water to soothe their supposedly overexcited nerves, and by prescribing milk diets, rest, and massages. However, neurologists began to recognize with psychiatrists that talking could help patients, establishing working relationships between doctor and patient. I know all types of sexual abuse was going down in those early asylums. Probably wicked stuff. Ugh, nasty. Anyway. Theoretical orientations in psychiatry and neurology. Although they increasingly recognize the value of psychotherapy, most psychiatrists and neurologists believed that the causes of the disorders they treated were biological. Madness was caused by troubles in the brain. Lesser syndromes, such as hysteria or neurasthenia, by troubles in the nervous system. Asylum psychiatrists in particular recognized that the symptoms of madness were so bizarre, the suffering of their patients so great, that the cause must lie in the brain. Psychiatrists and neurologists also believed there was genetic basis to insanity, because it is so often ran in families rather than breaking out at random. Some psychiatrists advanced the notion of biological degeneration, which represented madness as sliding back down the evolutionary ladder, from rational humanity to instinctive animality. Animality, that's an interesting word. There was a rival view to the dominant neuroscientific and genetic conception of mental illness, romantic psychiatry, so called because it held that the causes of mental illness lay in the patient's psychological history and life circumstances, especially their emotional lives. Romantic psychiatrists were also called the psychically oriented, distinguishing them from the biological orientation of the majority. The biological view was in part inspired by Enlightenment philosophy. Seeing mad psychiatrists, in contrast, saw madness as stemming from passions that had slipped the bonds of rational control. In practice, romantic psychiatrists spent hours discussing their patients' emotional lives and tried to instill in them religious and moral values. Although Freud denied the connection, psychoanalytic therapy was an extension of romantic psychiatry. In psychoanalytic form, romantic psychiatry largely displaced biological psychiatry until the biological revolution of the 1970s, when psychiatrists again looked to the brain and the genes for the cause of psychiatric disorders. I knew that freaky stuff was going down. Romantic psychiatrist, my ass. Anyway. French clinical psychology. Alfred Binet sharply distinguished French psychology from the psychologies of its neighbors. With relatively few exceptions, the psychologists of my country have left the investigations of psychophysics to the Germans and the study of comparative psychology to the English. They have devoted themselves almost exclusively to the study of pathological psychology, that is to say, psychology affected by disease. In France, psychology developed as an adjunct to medicine. German experimental psychology focused on sort of Platonic, normal, human adult mind. The British compared animal and human minds, and in Galton's work, described the statistically average mind. French psychology concentrated on abnormal, non-Western, and developing minds. Ribot, for example, said that the ideal subjects for scientific psychology were the madman, the primitive, and the child, which he regarded as providing natural experiments of greater value than laboratory ones. Neuroscience, as we have seen, advances by both laboratory and clinical work. In clinical neuroscience, investigators use experiments of nature, damage to the brain and nervous system caused by accident and disease, to illuminate normal functioning. Ribot advocated that psychologists do the same, studying non-normal minds as natural experiments that not only are interesting in themselves but can shed light on normal consciousness too. The French clinical tradition contributed to psychology the term subject, later ubiquitously used to describe people who participate in psychological studies, until replaced by the contemporary term participant. In French medicine, the word sujet meant a person under treatment or observation, and before that to a corpse to be used for dissection or a candidate for a surgical procedure. Binet and other French psychologists adopted the term to describe the object of their psychological investigations. The word subject was used similarly in English and was first employed in its modern sense by Cattell in 1889. As suggested by Binet's methods, the French model of psychological investigation differed from the French and German models. French psychology was more oriented to extensive investigations of single subjects, a legacy of its medical heritage. German psychology evolved out of philosophy and addressed the idealized mind of the philosophers. British psychology evolved out of the study of animals and mental testing, and was attuned to statistical aggregation of measurable differences between minds, whether within human minds or between various sorts of animal and human minds. French psychologists devoted much of their attention to hypnotism, which they linked to and used as a treatment for hysteria. In this connection, two theories arose as to the nature of the hypnotic trance. A.A. Libo, born 1823 and died in 1904, began one school of thought in Nancy, France, which was carried on by his student Hippolyte Bernheim, born 1837 and died in 1919. The Nancy school held that the hypnotic state was an intensification of certain tendencies in ordinary sleep or wakefulness. Some actions, even sophisticated ones, are automatic. We all respond impulsively to some suggestions. We all hallucinate in dreams. According to the Nancy school, in hypnosis, the conscious will lose its usual control over perception and action, and the orders of the hypnotist pass immediately and unconsciously into action or hallucinatory perception. The rival school of the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris maintained that because hypnotic suggestion could be used to remove hysteric symptoms, the hypnotic state must be an abnormal one, found in hysteric patients only. Hypnosis and hysteria were both seen as evidence of pathological nervous system. Hypnosis and hysteria were both seen as evidence of a pathological nervous system. The leading spokesman for the Salpêtrière school was Jean Martin Charcot, born 1825 and died in 1893. Under Charcot, Freud studied for several months. With Freud, the study of hypnotism became part of the psychology of the unconscious, for Freud used hypnosis in his early activities as a psychotherapist. In conclusion, The 19th century was a century of conflicts, and its conflicts are our conflicts. The Industrial Revolution brought unparalleled material progress and tremendous urban poverty. Religious revival was widespread, even as the foundations of belief were steadily eroded by science. People were inculcated with acute and ferocious sexual morality, while allowing or causing prostitution and crime to be endemic. The sciences and humanities flourished as never before, but the practical businessman sneered at the ivory tower intellectual. Pessimism and optimism mixed in the same mind. Wrote Carlyle, "Deep and sad as is our feeling that we stand yet in the bodeful night, equally deep, indestructible is our assurance that the morning also will not fail." Central to the 19th century was the conflict between the new scientific naturalism and the older beliefs in a transcendent spiritual reality. Naturalism, product of the Enlightenment, occasioned both hope and despair. It held out the hope of perpetual progress, of the perfectibility of humanity, of useful and profound knowledge of the universe. Yet it challenged the traditional religious beliefs people had accumulated and lived by for centuries. Science also threatened to dehumanize humans, reducing the individual to a collection of chemicals, laboring in a vast industrial machine. It seemed to strip the world of meaning, and each person of freedom and dignity. Proponents of naturalism did not see the conflicts. They believed that technical, scientific solutions could be found for every human problem. Their problem was to convince society for their sincerity and efficacy. Science became scientism, a new religion, most clearly seen in Comte's positivism, but also present in popularizing scientists such as Huxley. The naturalists benefited from being united in a single Newtonian conception of nature, differing among themselves only in detail. Forceful, optimistic, successful, natural science came to dominate the intellectual world. Out of the 19th century emerged the three founding forms of psychology. Wundt founded the psychology of consciousness. Freud founded the psychology of the unconscious. And various psychologists influenced by evolutionary thought founded the psychology of adaptation. All the concepts for each were in place, awaiting only the creative minds and forceful personalities needed to weld them into coherent psychological programs. Woo! And that's the end of chapter 7. That's the end of part 3. Now we're going to go to part 4, founding psychology. My God, a long build-up just to make it to chapter 8. Let's see where we are. So now that we finished part 3, we're jumping now to part 4, founding psychology. And chapter 8 goes from pages 219 to 254. Okay? And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, yeah, we're going to do all of that tomorrow. We're going to do all of that tomorrow. How many more chapters we got? We got 14 chapters. So that's 6 more chapters. I think we can do it. I think we could do it. And that's what we shall do. That's what we shall do. Okay? We're going to jump to that next time. We're going to go live again. We're going to do a live call-in show and do another episode of Can't Get You Out of My Head. And we're going to be reacting to that. Hopefully you enjoy that. I'm making more content coming out soon. Hopefully you enjoy that as well. Y'all be easy out there. This has been episode 17 of Book React. Check out all the previous episodes. Y'all be easy out there, and peace.